This module in the Western mystery tradition is really beginning what most people think of as the Western mystery tradition, because it's the synthesis that occurred in the Hermetic Renaissance between all the different traditions, astrology, Kabbalah, and so on in the West, united with traditions from the East through many, many different forces that brought these all together. In fact, we can say that the Graal tradition, the Grail tradition, is really reassembled at this point, and all the separate bits and pieces of it are brought together in a different kind of way. And the result of that is the production or the development of some people who become adepts. They become masters. We'll be looking at Nostradamus and some of the others that this time. And this period of time, the Hermetic Renaissance, occurs really in the 15th, 16th centuries, previous to the colonization of America, and it's still a very important part of things going on when America is colonized, and it has a lot to do with the spiritual traditions that prevail there, and in places where the Templars have gone to roost, like in Scotland and Portugal and so on. So we've kind of traced this all the way down from Akhmim, the school of Panopolis. We've looked at the Hermetic synthesis in alchemy and how it contributed to what we call the Druidic and the Christian Graal synthesis. We looked at the influence of Johannite mysticism in Asia Minor as it came through the Knights Templar, and the Arabs who developed the Pythagorean and Hermetic and alchemical sciences, and the whole science of alchemy, which really has roots in India and in the first, second centuries BC, and in Alexandria and other places like that, but really flowers in among the Arabs as both medicinal alchemy and other forms of transformational spiritual alchemy. And we're looking also at the whole Jewish tradition, which has a strong tradition in alchemy, and the great Kabbalistic tradition, which originally came from the Pythagorean Greek Kabbalistic tradition, and by the first century of the Christian era is well established in Judaism, but it's an oral tradition. Kabbalah means from the mouth of the teacher to the ear of the student, and only in about the 10th, 11th century in certain Jewish communities does Kabbalah get written down and added to and messed with in creative ways and so on. And that is, of course, of great interest to the Europeans, and the Christian Kabbalah, which we spell with a C, is developed. And all of this leads to what we call the European Hermetic Renaissance. And the great key that opens this and unlocks this whole period is the rediscovery, translation, and bringing back into the West, or bringing to the West actually for the first time, the writings of that are attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, the probably the greatest transformational mystery school of the Hellenistic period. And I've written about it for my dissertation, and it's available online, the earliest form of this. But the documents we have today for the Corpus Hermeticum, as it's called, are in Greek, and they are pretty much Platonized. They've been taken down through history, and Platonistic ideas, the ideas of Plato, are kind of encrusted upon them as they're brought down through. And so we have documents that are actually somewhat medieval translations that are brought into Europe, but the discovery of an actual Hermetic initiation tractate, which was the topic of my dissertation, that dates from, as we find now, from the 1st century, and we can determine that from astrological terms that are given in the tractate, and it comes from about the middle of the 1st century. It's about contemporary with the beginnings of Christianity, and it's full of a lot of very, very important things that become vital in the Western mystery tradition. Now, in the 12th century, 13th century, Albertus Magnus made a great compendium of all they were just called sciences, the branches of knowledge at that time. We would think of an awful lot of them as occult sciences. They were Hermetic sciences, Druidic sciences, etc. He wrote the Liber Secretorum, the Book of Secrets, which became the basic reference book for what would become the medieval Western mystery tradition, for herbology, for alchemy, for magical tradition, and so on. Albertus Magnus was a great and learned person who studied traditions before they were really expressly forbidden by the Inquisition in the way that they did become. And he brought the information all together, and he himself was an experimenter with many forms of divination and magic and alchemy and things like that. And then we have in this incredible civilization that developed in Spain, which was kind of a theosophical culture. It was the high point of European civilization for many centuries, where we had Christians and Jews and Muslims all living together in Spain, contributing to each other's understanding, and a great civilization flourishing. And Ramon Lull, who is known as Lully to the medieval people, brought together his synthesis of information that from these different traditions as well. He was considered to be a sage, as was Albertus Magnus, a Christian sage who was bringing together this information, these materials, again, before the Inquisitions began, before this information started to become really considered to be secret, occult information, too much related to other religions.
Is he sometimes known as Lily?
Lily?
Yeah.
No.
I've heard of an astrologer, Renaissance astrologer that they call him Lily.
Well, there is a Lily. There's also Lully, and this is Lully, and he's earlier. But basically, he integrated many of these ideas together with Kabbalah, Jewish Kabbalah, and Hermetic ideas and alchemical ideas, and so on, and put together a kind of theosophy that was an occult theosophy with knowledge of many different kinds of things, how to use plants, how to use the stars and other things to create certain remedies, and he was an expert in astrology as well. So I've never heard him called Lily, but maybe.
But there is a Lily.
Yeah, there probably is. I don't know who the Lily is. Anyway, he put together a lot of the understandings we have of astrology and of its relationship to Kabbalah. We're taking the much older astrological knowledge that was put down in the Tetrabiblos of Ptolemy and other earlier things, and he related that to basically to Kabbalistic knowledge. And here we see his his list of the Sephirot, Keter, Hakma, Bina, Chesed, and so on, and what it relates to in terms of what they relate to as today we would think of as the 32 paths, and these are 10 of them, and so on. And he used these 10 as a 10-path system, and these are his terms in Latin: voluntas, will; sapientia, wisdom, and so on. Now, at this time, we know that in the Carolingian Renaissance, when Charlemagne and the church people that he worked with reformed European religion to get rid of the Celtic Christianity and all those sort of thing and make it over into Roman Catholicism. He had to educate the clergy, he had to make them literate in Latin. And of course that was just the wrong thing to do, because as soon as you teach people how to read, that you don't control what they read. And so as a result, what happened is, originally around the cathedrals, there were what were called the canons of the cathedrals, which were places where the clergy were taught. They sort of became theological schools, but they became places where also other people studied in a seminary-like fashion. They learned to read, and they began to study much farther afield than simple things. They went back into some of the Latin versions of some of the Greek theologians and so on, and eventually a whole discipline was developed that would become what we call the university. The first universities were actually established at Notre Dame and places like that, and a lot of the students at the universities would go and they would be able to become teachers, and they could go out to other smaller regions and they could teach people not just to read, but they could teach them different kinds of things. And so the beginning of really what we call colleges or universities, university education and so on, but it was still part of the clerical system of the church, and people were clerics or minor clerics who did this. But as these people graduated, and the way you would graduate from this university, you would quibble with your professor. To quibble meant to have a debate in which other people would sit around and judge who really won the debate or who got so many points and so on. And when you could out-debate your teacher, or at least hold your own with your teacher, then you were considered to be a teacher, a doctor, a teacher of the philosophy of something. This is the doctor of philosophy. And people would then leave the university and they'd go out and return to their homes or other places and get a job as a teacher. However, there was no way of knowing who was validly and truly a teacher and had been educated and who hadn't. And so a lot of these people went out and found that there were all kinds of phonies that had taken the jobs. So they went back to the universities and established colonies on the left bank of Paris and places like that, and had riots until finally the Pope established the first what we call degrees. And these were pieces of paper that had a seal on it that affirmed that in fact you had been trained and you would pass these things. So the first universities were established. Well, even though people were trained in reading, etc., there were so many. There were the lively arts that had to be studied, 7 arts. And the way that it was studied and the way it was learned was mostly through memory and memorization. And this was a process we call the art of memory, the ars memoria. Originally, the Romans had developed this. It's a way of learning and holding in your mind, or being able to access in your mind, a great deal of information about things. You know, in your Jyotish classes, you've got a special pen that you've consecrated and to help you remember things you write down and all that sort of thing. Well, this was this memorial aid worked a little differently. You associated bits of things you had learned with articles and rooms in a great house. And this is a method that was used by the Roman. Cicero describes it in much detail and how it's used. And when people had complex things to learn and with many parts to it, and for you to be able to dredge this back up in your memory and use it again. So you'd associate topics with spaces or rooms, and you would imagine a great mansion or something like this, and each of the spaces and rooms had different compartments and different things that had to do with different topics. So the same kind of learning by graphic association was used in the tantras and in deep spiritual practices. So that, for example, in Kala Chakra Tantra, the mandala that you look at is an emblem of the entire system of astrology that goes with it, and many other kinds of things. And when one is able to sit and in 2 hours take oneself through the entire system that's represented by the mandala, you have achieved the state that you need to go. But you have much to learn in order to get there. It may take you 5 or 8 years to learn that material. For example, if you were to take an algebra class in college, and then you needed to recall all that information so that you could reconstruct a textbook yourself, so to speak, you would start out with a chapter or a room or something associated with what an equation was, and then you would go to working with things in one unknown, and then you would go with working with things in two variables, and you'd have something for the quadratic formula, and something for this and something for that. And these would be like rooms you would walk through, and you would find things in the rooms that would remind you of these things. So it's learning by graphic association in memory. And it was used by all the people who became sages and became developed in these things, and who became scholars like Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus and so on. As I gave you the example of the algebra wing, which would have a scale which would represent the properties of equations, and maybe a quadratic equation closet and things like this. Anyway, whatever you might have. So this is kind of a medieval drawing of what such a fictional house or university would look like, with all of its different rooms and all the things that would associate to memory. Giordano Bruno was one of the first great Hermetic advocates, who was tortured and killed by the Inquisition. And his whole system of Hermetic work was done totally through the art of memory. And he came together with a very complex architecture for a grand summa of all the what we call the liberal arts, and that could be represented graphically. So they were divided into the seven arts were divided into the trivium of three and the quadrivium. There was grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, which had been taught in ancient Greece. In fact, the main thing that was taught to people in Greece was grammar, rhetoric, and dialectic, so that they could hold their own in debates and be able to have political power and sway people in their conversations. And then the other four were music, mathematics, geometry, and astronomy. These were much more important to people who would like architects and Freemasons and things like this, especially astronomy and geometry. When you are initiated into Freemasonry, in the apprentice degree, you will be looking at a staircase that represents these disciplines and things that you're supposed to know about in mathematics and geometry and so on. This is part of the knowledge that is passed down. So visualization, allegorization, all these things were absolutely essential and essential to Hermetic studies. One of the important things we will see later on in the next module, when we study the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, which follows the Hermetic Renaissance, is the Rosicrucian vault of Christian Rosenkreuz. This is kind of a 7th century expansion of this. We have the image and the idea of the Hermetic sage as the person who he gains his knowledge through books, but he is able to exercise them without the books. This is Flood's image of the Hermetic sage. He has in his mind all these things, and it's all divine knowledge. It's one of the images I use as icons. Now, Nicholas Flamel was one of the first great adepts of alchemy. Flamel was originally worked as the invention of book printing, and the Gutenberg book sort of thing and all this had just come out, and so a lot of people were working with books and that were printing books or doing other things related to books. Flamel was working in this way, and the story goes that he discovered a book that gave him, that took him on a journey that brought him to learn some of the great secrets of Arabic alchemy. And this is the alchemists that from the Middle East and Egypt. That would be Arabic and Egyptian and so on. And that's where all the great secrets of the alchemists were to be found. But they could also be found in books that were translated. The book that he discovered, this is called the Book of Abraham the Jew, which you can now have a translation of online, and so I put the link up here. And in this book, he was given the secrets of how to make the Philosopher's Stone, the water stone of the wise, the Sophic hydrolith, as it was known. And there is quite an interesting story about his journey as he becomes an alchemist and a great alchemist. And I've given you another link that you can go to read about it. But the tradition of Flamel supposedly is carried all the way into the present in France by the people that are known in English as the philosophers of nature. However, they went out of business in this country a few years ago because of some threats and legal things. They translated themselves over. They brought all their information and all their knowledge over from France to the United States in the late 70s, early 80s, actually late 80s and early 90s, I think it was, when there got to be a whole lot of repression that would start to put on occult and esoteric groups. But they carry all the secrets and traditions associated with Flamel for plant alchemy and metal alchemy. And you can still get a hold of that material. We have a lot of it ourselves, and we have worked with some of it. And this is a drawing that we find from one of his books. You might notice that one of the books about Flamel, you might notice that there are the Hebrew letters up there. It's associated with Kabbalah, as well as Kabbalah by this time has become a very important part of things, and the Hebrew tradition in alchemy is very strongly recognized. Here is a thing that appears on a book and also on an inscription in, I think, his native town, France. I've told you about the philosophers of nature. So these are people that kind of were some of the adepts that precluded and were operating before the Hermetic Renaissance. What is the Hermetic Renaissance? Well, the Hermetic Renaissance, really, we date from the time that the Corpus Hermeticum, the corpus of the writings of Hermes Trismegistus, is brought over from the East, and purchased from Arabs, and translated into languages like German that people can read. And what happens in the Hermetic Renaissance is we get a synthesis of European alchemy with Hermetic philosophy, totally with Hermetic philosophy. So that all the terms that we will find in alchemy, all the symbols that we'll find in alchemy and in astrology will be put into a great kind of unified system, and that will all be related to the human body, the microcosm, the macrocosm of the human body, how the universe is within the body and the body is within the universe, and how one creates remedies and healing, etc. There was always herbal healing. There was always the use of leeches for bleeding people, and there were all kinds of other remedies. A lot of them came from the Druidic formulas and things, which may go all the way back to Neanderthal sciences. We don't know, but the use of plants and so on. But now this is all brought together so that that astrology is used with alchemy, which is used with pharmacology, which is all in a unified system. Now, one of the great Medicis, Cosimo de' Medici, was the person who financed an expedition to go meet with the Arabs to see from Arab booksellers what kinds of esoteric and occult information could be bought. And the Medicis were a very wealthy Venetian family that controlled much of the politics of the medieval period. And he sent a fellow named Marsilio Ficino to go find what he could find, and gave him a large sum of money and said, go buy what you can buy. It's sort of like going to Amazon.com and just, get the best stuff, Because at that time, people were realizing there was all this great, wonderful material, these philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, and all these kinds of things that we were just now discovering with the coming of the Renaissance, and this material is being brought back. Now, I should say that probably Florence, Italy, was probably the place that financed more of the Renaissance than anything else. And there was a group of people in Florence that formed what were called the Fratres Lucis. It means the Brothers of Light, but they were both men and women. And they also financed things. They were about contemporary with Christopher Columbus in the 15th century, 1492, and so on. And they provided money for people to go and find these documents and bring them and have them translated, etc. So Ficino went and he found several documents, but he found several of the dialogues of Plato, and he also found the Corpus Hermeticum. Well, Cosimo de' Medici was on his deathbed. He didn't have much time. So he insisted that they translate first the Corpus Hermeticum, because he wanted to hear the great Hermes Trismegistus speak. And Plato was good, but Hermes Trismegistus is way better. And so that's how it was translated originally. So, and that was in 1491.
Right before they kicked all the Jews out of Spain.
That's about the time they kicked all the Jews out of Spain, right. And as it's the same decade as the founding of the Fratres Lucis and so on. And by the way, I am a Grand Master of the Fratres Lucis, and I have that as one of the charters that I carry on historically. The printing press had been invented, and all of a sudden everything exploded in Europe, and there were books all over the place, because instead of having to hand copy things, they could be printed out very quickly and many copies made. So it was quickly published in many languages all over Europe and the British Isles. And here are some of the original editions of, this is in Latin, of the Corpus Hermeticum. And this started what we call the Hermetic Renaissance. But it was translated not just in Latin, it was translated in German and all kinds of other languages. Now, the Hermetic sciences, it's very difficult to find any great summary of the Hermetic sciences, but the greatest one is probably in the statement known as the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, which seems to be very ancient. And I think you'll recognize the most important part of it. That which is above is as that which is below. And that which is below is as that which is above. Doesn't sound like very profound stuff, but it is, because the world, as people understood it from the Catholic Church, was a three-storied universe, and what was below had no connection to what was above. There was a divine world, there was the human world, the physical world, and we were sort of like comparing the contents of your toilet to the contents of a great feast and a great banquet. One was before and one was after, I suppose. I don't know, but the Hermetic insight was the insight for science, which basically is, by studying physical nature, we will come to know the divine nature. Mother Jenny used to say, study nature, and she will reveal her secrets unto you. And the secrets of nature were the secrets of God. They were the secrets of the universe, and we could understand the nature of the divine universe by studying the physical universe and understanding it. This is the meaning of the Emerald Tablet. So astrology, alchemy, theurgy, Goetia, the Pythagorean sciences, and architecture and engineering, all these things numerology, Kabbalah, and all these things were synthesized together as ways of understanding the divine. It was another kind of theology, a very different theology than the Roman Catholic Church had, what we would maybe call a theosophy. And in medicine, pharmacology and the preparation using the astrological hours and things like this became the means and the mode for things. And human beings were no longer regarded as excrement walking on excrement. Human beings were considered to be in the image of God and the image of God's universe. And the attitude that the change that brought about was almost heretical, and it was something that now became quite feared by the church, because it was a rather seductive, and there were many Jesuits and many people in very high positions, even bishops, who liked this philosophy very much and wanted it to become the new philosophy of the church. And there were many of the old timers that didn't want that to happen, and also just the real extreme conservatives who felt that this was all from the devil and all this sort of thing. To be holy was to not bathe. I think when Thomas à Becket was found dead in the cathedral, there was 1/4 of an inch of grime and lice all over his body, which was an indication of his sanctity, because he didn't bathe. He wasn't, one of those people who would, take care of his body that way and do all this sort of thing.
Cleanliness is next to godliness.
Yes, and of course, and to Protestants, cleanliness is next to godliness. It's a much better philosophy, I think. And divination. So all these things are linked together, and they're linked together as divine sciences. We have, by the way, the term hermeneutics, which comes from the name Hermes. So the term hermeneutics refers to interpreting things in dreams, omens, and in biblical studies it has to do with interpreting the sayings of Jesus and so on. It's called hermeneutics. Comes from the word Hermes. Hermes is from a Greek term meaning to interpret or speak in tongues. And Hermes was originally the god of travelers and traders who would need to speak in other people's tongues in order to trade with them, etc. So he was also known as the interpreter and so on, communicator. This is a hermetic, what I call a hermetic mandala. As you can see, there are allegorical things here on the earth, allegories. There's a male being holding something that looks like the sun, and a female being that's supposed to often representing Isis, holding something that looks like the moon, Sol and Luna. And we have lions, and we have various kinds of bushes and trees with astrological symbols on them, etc. And these are in the natural physical world. These are things that are interpreted in the natural physical world from nature. And then above it we have the same world, seen in another view, the divine world, where at the top we have Jehovah, as the Protestants call it, Yahweh, and the choir of angels, and we also have the zodiac and other kinds of things, the stars and the supernal beings and so on. So these two are related. They're just, you have to be able to see them. You have to be able to perceive them through what we have the means to perceive, which is nature. So, as above, so below. As below, so above was the great insight of the Hermetic science. And so that processes that happened in nature were considered to be allegories of even greater things. You see, it's very Platonistic. Plato's idea was that there was a world of forms, and that the world itself that we see was a world of shadows of things that were forms, but they were related to them. And so our ideas the world of ideas, as he called them, and by ideas didn't mean opinions, it meant these archetypal forms and so on. The world of ideas is reflected in the lower world that we're in, but in ways that are difficult to recognize unless we have special eyes to see them. So the invisible and divine worlds are encoded and allegorized in physical nature. Here's a nice colored Hermetic allegory showing the philosopher peeking through the veils of nature to be able to see the real world, the world of reality. And in Hermetic philosophy, that's called ta'anta, the things that really are real, the things that are really real, ta'anta, that which truly exists. And if you read the Hermetic literature, you will find that term used a great deal. So, an interesting thing about a Hermetic way of looking at things, it's kind of the opposite of what we find in mandalas, in Buddhist mandalas, where the deity is always at the center. Because at the center of Hermetic mandalas, we have the earth and the elements at the very center, rather than on the outer part. And connecting the high worlds, the upper worlds, and the lower worlds, we have an anthropomorphic figure. In this case, it's Isis, the mother of the world. But mankind is also considered to be half human and half natural. So mankind is in the same position. And you see the little chains that go from the hand of this figure down to the ape-like looking guy down here near the elemental things of the world. And then another chain going from this wrist, which is the right hand, all the way up to God, the deity, and so on. So this is a way that the Hermetic philosopher saw human beings in a Christian three-storied universe. We were the midpoint between the human, that is, between the natural world and the divine world. So here we have the three worlds, the three-storied universe, and we now have a way of synthesizing this with the old Christian three-storied universe that goes all the way back to Indico. The fellow I showed you, whatever his name is, Cosimo or something like that, who said, no, the Greek philosopher's all wrong, the world is not round, it's flat, and all this sort of thing. Well, you can see that by this time, the roundness of the world is being accepted, even in Christian circles. So the Hermetic celestial spheres and divine realms are represented somewhat astrologically. So you will find, for example, here we have the 7 planetary spheres. At the center we have the Earth itself. Here we have the zodiacal fixed zodiac and the fixed stars. And here we have, beyond the firmament, we have the firmament and the crystalline spheres. And then finally the primum mobilum, which is the prime mover. It becomes really the idea of deity that you find in Freemasonry and other forms of deism that the early founders of this country were pretty much believers in, that God kind of designed the whole world and let it run by his laws, that sort of thing. And so this is the kind of idea that's being built in. And so as you can see, what we've got here is a basis for the development of science, because science means experiment, which means experience, experiment, doing things in nature to learn about all reality by studying nature. And we're also going to not make any compromise with theology on it. We're going to let our studies take us where they lead us, and knowledge is going to lead us where it leads us. So this is preserved still very much in the church, in its three-storied universe ideas of the choirs of angels and deity above and so on, and the 7 planets and all this. So basically this all gets combined together as a macrocosm, as a universe, with God and the divine things at the very farthest out regions. And it's very much like the Gnostic spheres that we studied, the Hermetic spheres, the Gnostic spheres, the Pythagorean spheres that we studied in much earlier modules, that were very much denied by the early church fathers, and now they've come to a view of this that does take into account a world that is not flat, a world that is part of the spheres that go around it and so on. So here we have our three-storied universe in the theological realms, and this is very important because now there is a way for very educated churchmen to incorporate Hermetic ideas into their theology, and they do. In fact, there's a room in the Vatican that was once the room of the Borgia Pope, the one pope that was from the Borgia family, who wanted to completely change all the theology of the church into Hermetic theology, Hermetic philosophy, and was almost able to do it. He was sort of in the position, I suppose, that one might say that Tutankhamun was in, who wanted to change everything over to the idea of the solar deity. And as soon as he died, all of his images were defaced, and the priest took it over and took it back. And of course, he did not have really idealistic reasons for doing it. It was part of a way of consolidating his power as the pharaoh, but and doing what he wanted.
That was Akhenaten.
I'm sorry, that's right, King
Akhenaten.
Akhenaten, yes. Yeah, that's right, King Akhenaten, yes. And the Borgia Pope led a kind of very strong movement that went through all the Florentine and Venetian families and so on. In those days, to be a pope, you didn't have to be a saint. You had to be a rich person's son, and the people that controlled all the clerical things and bishops and so on were from wealthy families, generally speaking. Not always, but very often that was where the political leadership came. And so he had his way for a while, and there is a room in the Vatican that's sealed that has paintings of Hermes Trismegistus and stuff all over. That was one of his rooms, and it's still there, but it's actually sealed up. And but there was a time when the Vatican did come very close to possibly converting to this way of looking at things. Now, in the 16th century, for example, we find at the cathedral at Sienna, we have this is a pavement. This is painted into the pavement, and a lot of the clergy wanted to make Christian theology coherent with Hermetic philosophy, and were clandestine Hermetics. Here we have one of the most common themes was that Moses was a student of Hermes Trismegistus, that Moses learned all of his occult arts from Hermes, who was the great teacher. Here we have this right in the cathedral. This is before the Inquisition made this too dangerous. We have Hermes teaching Moses and handing him this book and so on. And so the idea that Hermes Trismegistus was contemporary with Moses and taught him his secret arts of alchemy and things and so on was a very strong legend at that time. So that's how close the Catholic Church came, because this is a very powerful movement. This is supposed to be the secret books of Moses that are being information's being handed to him.